Well, hi, Becca. I'm so excited to have you on the Author Revolution podcast. It's you've been like on my to-do list of bringing you here for I don't even know how long. And I
Yeah.
did talk a little bit in the intro about how you finally did come into my sphere. But for my audience who might not know about you quite yet, do you want to tell them a little bit more about who you are and what you do? I know it's a long list of incredible things. So
Yeah, I'm a success coach for writers specifically. I mean, we do other stuff like we coach in corporate and do stuff like that. But generally speaking, I work with writers because I'm also a novelist. And that was how I got into doing it is I was noticing that my friends were struggling with certain things that I knew could be explained through either like systems thinking or through personality, like behavioral science, right? Because that's kind of where my background is. And so I was like, okay, I can help you figure out why this is not working for you. And then we would, help them. And this was really early back in the like early days of indie. And so I would start individually coaching people. And then I kind of just kept coaching more and more and more people. And what I do now is partly, I mean, I still coach, I still do individual success coaching, but I'm also trying to kind of translate some of that data into like, here are the general patterns that I see among writers and how writers are successful in different ways and how it's possible for you to be wired extremely differently from the people that are successful that you're looking at, and for you to still have success in just a different way than they might have it, because the way that people are successful is so nuanced and different. And it's just likely that you don't know anyone who's successful in your particular way yet. But there are people out there who follow the same success patterns that you do. They're just not, for whatever reason, in your purview yet. And so I kind of try to translate that by saying, like, here are the general patterns that I see from having coached 6,000 plus individual people. And that's not like 6,000 people took my class or, 6,000 people heard me speak at a conference. This is like, I sit down one-on-one for at least 45 minutes with more than 6,000 individual people.
that's
Because my
amazing.
goal is to try and see like, how are people the same and how are they different? How does that success difference matter? How does your personality matter? And then just kind of give big picture, like, this is how we're different and this is why. And yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell, I guess.
That is so cool. I love that. That's all the things that you're so interested and passionate about. And it comes through with like everything that I've seen you talk about. You've got a YouTube channel that's amazing. I've seen you speak at 20 Books. I've seen you speak at Idaho. I mean, other places as well, but obviously those are most recently. I can't remember how you came into my sphere. I want to say it was my friend Liza Street. I'm almost positive it was her.
I recognize that name.
Yeah, and she's amazing. I love her so much. I think she got me turned on to your Dear Writer books, and I started reading those a while back.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a while when you first started. I think the very first one. But when we were at 20 Books to 50K, your talk just blew me away because you were talking about author success archetypes. And it was the first time I'd heard you speak about that particular aspect of it. So I wanted to start there because I know it's kind of the next phase of what you're doing. And we'll get to kind of what you do with strengths, but could you explain a little bit about this concept? Because I know people are going to be like, oh my gosh. And for me, it really triggered in my brain some aha moments.
Yeah, like the easiest way to kind of describe it is that we already do this without realizing it with like plotters and pantsers, for instance. And we have a lot of discussions in the author sphere about like, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? And I'm like, well, like everything, it's a continuum, it's not a binary, right? And so
Yep.
when you think about how people are successful at story creation, what you're essentially asking when you say, are you a plotter or a pantser, is I'm asking, can you write a coherent, clear, compelling story without needing to plan ahead what you're writing, or can't you? And just how much do you need to know about what you're writing before you can write a clear, compelling, coherent story? And there's a continuum with that this is why whenever we say, are you a plotter or a pantser, almost everyone is like, well, a little of both, because that is the reality, is the majority of us are in between and not on the extremes. And so we already kind of know a little bit about success archetypes just by having that discussion. But in addition to plotting and pantsing, there are so many different continuums that exist out there. And what my job has been in doing this high volume of coaching of individual people is, so like people will come to me and they'll say, this is what I do in this particular arena. And because we talked about trailblazing a little bit, I'll say, let's talk about writing to market. That's like one of the continuums. How do you create a book that is sold in the market for a particular market? And how do you relate to that market? There's a continuum that exists. And on one side is the trailblazer, which is like, I want to write something the market has never seen before, and I want to be totally different and blaze a trail that people will follow me onto, right? And then there are the drafters who are taking what the trailblazers do and sort of trying to iterate it, and seeing if they can make it better. And sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't, but because sometimes the trailblazers hit on the thing that people are actually going to follow them on. And then sometimes the drafters, just stop drafting and then go draft something else. That's just what drafters do. And then we have this segment of evergreens, which is they don't really need to look at the market intentionally in order to be able to create good books, because so much of the story is innate to them. Like there's some level of capacity in either liking the genre that they write, or having an id list of some kind, or being a discovery writer, whatever it is about them, that they don't need to be looking at the market. And then there's the islands, who they may or may not watch the market, but when it comes time to sit down and write, they really don't care. They are an island unto themselves, right? So the reason that I needed to have that discussion is that I would get a lot of evergreens coming to me saying, well, okay, so I need to write to market in order to be successful. And I'm like, wait a minute. No, you don't have to write to market in order to be successful. And then we would have to have a conversation about why that is the case, and et cetera. And I'm like, look, it's just easier for me to explain that there's a continuum of people. You can be anywhere on that continuum and still have success, because that's the key to these archetypes. It's not just that it's possible for people to be wired this way. It's that it's possible for them to write books that people want to read, which by nature means that they are marketable, right? So it's possible to write books that people want to read without ever studying the market, without intentionally trying to write to market, without doing any research. Or it's possible to sell books by intentionally writing what you think the market might not want or might want later, because you're trailblazing, right? So like it's possible to sell at any point in that continuum, but because it's easy to teach people how to write to market, it is easier to teach how to be a drafter. So the majority of what is put out there for like, how do we do this author life, is aimed at drafters, really. Sure. And then everybody else is sort of like on their own to figure it out, whether they're, able to question the premise of writing to market or not. And then they get really frustrated because they're not able to be successful at the drafting. And so the whole goal of doing this particular continuum, and like I said, there are so many others, but the goal of this particular continuum was to answer the questions that I would get from people about, why can't I write to market? Why, when I try to do it, is it not working? And then what should I be doing instead? And I'm like, oh, my sweet summer child, let me show you, right? It's like,
right?
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Well, we had an interesting conversation before we started. There's always interesting conversations before we start. So I have to go back to this a little bit. I was mentioning how, like with my urban fantasy side, I feel definitely more of the trailblazer energy. But now that I'm kind of shifting into rom-com, and I've just been enjoying like the reading process and enjoying it from the writer, or from the reader perspective, it was never meant intentionally to be like research mode. It was just meant to be like, let's immerse myself as the reader again, and like enjoy that process. So I feel much more like an evergreen in that pen name. Yeah. I mean, a little bit of drafter, but not really. Like I'm not looking at what other people are doing and trying to create it or trying to do it better or any of those things. I feel like it's more just, this is the story and it's innate in me. So it's an interesting like position. Do you feel like a lot of authors have, like, even people in general, but like where you can be multiple archetypes based off of different things?
Yeah, it really depends on what actually happens when you're writing, right? And whether or not it's successful. Because I think that's always the question for me about it. Is an author success archetype different for different people? It's So this is the best way to describe it. If you're a trailblazer and you really are only a trailblazer, when you start trying to evergreen, you'll eventually start trailblazing without realizing it.
Ah.
And it might happen by accident. It might happen without you intending it to happen. But just after talking to you about it, I don't anticipate that it's predictable that it's going to happen, because it really does feel like there's a different energy. Like you do feel more like you have evergreen energy about that platform. Because I do also think we kind of were talking about it in terms of like this pen name and then this pen name, and I feel very trailblazery in this pen name. And I had said like, oh, that makes total sense, because we have a lot of like nonfiction people, for instance, who kind of say like, I'm definitely not a drafter in my fiction, like I'm an evergreen in my fiction, but then they are very much drafters in their nonfiction. And then the way that they act over time will show like, yes, you're definitely a drafter. So I have seen people be different things in different platforms, but usually what'll happen is you'll have like a type where you have wild success at something. And then that'll be where you're the most aligned. And if you have a secondary type, it'll be like, well, let's see, is it possible that I was actually an evergreen the whole time and I didn't know it? Or is it possible that I am going to be a trailblazer in my evergreen? But it's also possible that you could legitimately be both. Because, and this was the hard thing, I mentioned this at 20 books. The hard part about having this discussion predictively in the future is that the market is capricious, right? Like the market is unpredictable. And it's very, very difficult to know for sure, just because it fits all of the things that it should fit, that it's actually going to sell. So it's so hard to say. This is part of why when I have the discussion, we're almost always look at what has happened rather than like what's coming in the future. Because it's so hard to say like, I'm going to do this in an evergreen way, and then it's 100% going to be successful, because evergreens can write series that don't sell, and so can trailblazers, and whatever.
Right.
But yeah, it's definitely possible to have. It's not like an Enneagram number, right, where you pretty much are just one core motivation all the time. This is more about all systems alignment. So like if my entire system of being a urban fantasy writer aligns with me trailblazing, because there's all these parts of myself that aren't getting exercised in other areas. And then this part of rom-com sort of fits in with my evergreen nature and the time in life that I'm at, right? Where if I've had a wild amount of success in one genre, I don't necessarily need to have a wild amount of success in a second genre if I am okay with where I'm at. So then that might make you more likely to be evergreen in that experiment. But yeah, it's definitely possible.
Yeah. When I first started writing, I would say, I wonder, like the way that you're describing it, if I was more evergreen in the beginning, because like I didn't really care about trailblazing. I didn't care about what the readership was. There was just a story I knew I had to get out, and I had a lot of fun with it,
Yeah,
and so it
that
wasn't
sounds very
necessarily
evergreen.
about that. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But the more I worked on it and the more I kind of played around with the ideas of it, there were definitely times where ideas stood out, and I'm like, I don't want to do that because everybody else is doing it.
Everybody does it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like my PA, I've said this on the podcast before, my PA kept pushing me to write werewolf stuff. And I'm like, I don't want to do werewolves. No. And so when KF Breen and Shannon Mayer started doing all of the like the midlife stuff, I'm like, I haven't seen any midlife wolf things or female alphas. Oh, now I can do it. And so that's how it all kind of came to be.
Do you have ideation or strategic in your strengths?
I think so. Yes, I believe I do. Let me look. Let me see what my top were. I'm a relator first, then strategic, activator, maximizer, and then ideation. So yeah, those
I
are
was
mine.
going to say, so the strengths, CliftonStrengths success metrics are more broad in terms of they're not specific to authors. They're more broad for the whole population. And the strength means that these are the things that are the best about me, right? Like this is the thing that I have the most instinctive, easy time doing. So ideation is all about having new and different ideas. And
Okay.
specifically not wanting to do what everyone else has done, and then having like an ability to make a new idea out of old ideas also, right? So there's an
Yep.
element of ideation that if you are evergreen in your creation, like where you actually create the best when you are in love with what you're doing and it's organic to who you are. And then that ideation comes along and is like, but not with this. Oh, but let's do this, right? But let's try that. Like both of those can still be can still be possible. It's just what you see is I am at my best in story creation when I sort of have a full heart about what I'm writing, like that I am interested in what I'm doing and that I'm invested, and that I kind of can't make myself write something just because other people think that I should do it. Then that ends up with me just writing what I want anyway, which is why I'm sort of joking about like, hey, it's possible that you may trailblaze as an evergreen if you are a trailblazer, because
Sure.
when you get into writing, you'll get so frustrated with like what has been done that you'll just,
That is
trailblaze and
true.
then watch for everyone to follow you. So that'll be a big question mark, I think.
That
Yeah.
that will be, because I could definitely see myself, trying to write force proximity, for instance, and being like, I can't do it. I have to make fun of it or something. Like, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so
Oh,
fascinating. That does
right.
sound, well, it's, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll obviously get into Clifton strengths in a second, but I want to dig just a little bit deeper with these author archetypes, or the success archetypes, because you've mentioned, I can't remember if it was your YouTube channel or somewhere, but how we don't obviously have enough exploration or talk about, whether it be in conferences or other places, about how there are different success metrics, and how oftentimes when people are up on stage, they're talking about it from a very specific success archetype and not talking about it from the others. Do you think that there's a reason why there hasn't been a whole lot of debate? Like, is there a specific archetype that likes to talk about what's winning, what's working? Or is it just like, literally, we had no idea that other people could succeed other ways?
So some of it is, so like, let's talk about the Clifton strengths for just a second, because they're very like, when you think about the most instinctive thing about you at all, right? Like that's your number one strength. And to a point where it will not make sense to you that other people are not like this, right? Like I have a number one input, which means that I'm like a compulsive Googler. I am obsessed with Googling everything. And
Love it.
anytime anyone brings something up, I'm like, oh, let me go look that up. I wonder, because I'm very curious, right, by nature.
Right.
Um, and so when I meet people who don't automatically Google things when someone brings it up, or they don't like kind of have their phone with them at all times to be able to like, compulsively Google things, it never makes sense to me. I'm like, how can you hear someone talk about something interesting and not immediately need to go look it up like a compulsion? And it's
Right.
because I have this trait that is extremely high, that is so instinctive for me that I can't see it. It's like a blind spot, right? And we call this our a 3,000 words a minute level, right? Because that's the top 1% of speed reading. And that was kind of the introduction into strengths theory in the first place, was trying to see, hey, if we took a whole bunch of average readers, could we bring them all up to the same level if we just gave them a really good teacher? And then they tested these two groups where they started off with like the average speed at 90 words a minute, and the above average people were at 350, and they put them in groups together, put them through the same class. And then at the end, the average group had gone from 90 to 150, and the above average group had gone from 350 to 3,000. So like the ability to
Wow.
get better faster at this thing that you have such a high natural capacity in, it's almost like, of course, you're not going to recognize that you have that blind spot because it feels so easy. It's like, well, if I can do it, anyone can do it, because it's something that just comes so naturally to me. And we don't recognize that, like, for every number one input, there's a 34 input. And I have dated him, and he is not like me at all. Like, it was painful. It was very painful. But my first instinct is knowing everything. his last instinct is knowing everything. So if I design a preparatory material for being successful at being a writer based on you have to know everything and be completely connected and compulsively go look everything up and take every course, he would fail every time. He's brilliant at what he does, but not in the same way that I am. And so if I set him up for success, assuming that you have to be like me in order to be successful, because that's the way that I was successful, then he's going to fail. But there's a way for him to be successful. It's just, we have to figure out how to set up his success plan in a way that takes advantage of his 3,000 words a minute level stuff instead of mine. But to your question, yeah, absolutely. There are certain strengths that find hard work to just be easier than other strengths. There are some strengths that find making strategic decisions to be the easiest and most important thing that they do. There are strengths that find communication and talking about what you do and selling themselves to be the easiest thing for them to do. And for every person in this industry that is good at that, there are thousands of people who are 34 at that, right? So it's like, yeah, we need to understand that there is no such thing as an expectation that will work for everyone. It's always individualized.
I love that. And I think it makes so much sense in my brain too, because so speaking of Enneagrams, I'm an Enneagram 9. And so it's like, I love seeing like all of the different perspectives and how they all can work together. And like, it's totally okay that you think this thing and I think this thing, and we can find that balance of how it's working for all of us. It's like, the concept just absolutely, I love it. And I think more people need to understand that it's okay to have a different strength. It's okay to be good at something that is completely different from what other people are telling you how to handle it, how to do it, whatever. So cool. I love it. I think it's one of the most fascinating things that like I've uncovered too. Yeah. Meaning uncovered you, because it was just like, oh, this is so cool. That is such a neat way. Fun. For sure. Do you have, okay, so obviously this is a big topic and I want to get into the Gallup Strengths Finder and CliftonStrengths. And so do you have any resources for authors who are wanting to dig deeper into this idea of success, author success archetypes?
So I have some videos on my TikTok channel that are about that. Right now, we're still figuring out how we're going to release this stuff, because I'm not a fan of releasing things before they're ready to be predictively helpful for people. And right now what we're finding is there still is some refining to do in how we figure out who is what, right? Like how to decide who is what thing. So currently we're primarily using it on the YouTube channel. Like when I discuss things, we often will say like, well, trailblazers will be likely to do this. So you'll see it peppered in the videos, but I did a 4-part series on my YouTube channel on my TikTok channel, and actually let me put a link to this on my links page, which I'll give you the link to my links page. And I'll just collate all those into one place so that people can see them. They will be coming at some point. We are going to do more kind of explainer videos. But actually the 20 books talk is probably the easiest place to watch. Because I talked about, well, I didn't talk about 2 continuums, but I at least talked about the Trailblazer one in that video.
Sure. I think you talked about the Pantsers and Plotter, and you definitely went over all 4 of the archetypes and how they worked. And so that was, to me, just so fascinating how the whole thing kind of made sense, and all the knobs and the sliders,
the dials,
and I love that.
Sliders.
That was great. That was great. As a visual
person,
I'm like, that is so cool. I love that.
It was so much easier. Yeah.
Right. So obviously I had the privilege of speaking to you again in Idaho when we were there, and you spoke, I believe it's more about productivity and the whole, like, we were trying to be productive, and every like technology thing kept going up and down, but it's just funny. You also, in that process though, like reminded me of CliftonStrengths in that talk, because you talk about this pretty frequently. And I've also followed obviously Claire Taylor and her stuff on Enneagrams. So I was curious if you could describe for my audience, like, what is the difference between these 2 types of personality resources? Like, are they the same? Do they jive together, or are they like completely different animals?
Yeah, they really do jive together well. They're interestingly, they're not predictive at all. So like, you're not going to find that like all 9 Enneagrams have these strengths, because they're really testing totally different they're both behavioral science, but they're testing different types of behaviors. And so Enneagram is more about your core motivation, right? Like, what is it what will make you take action every single time you need to take action, either in a generative way or a non-generative way, is that core fear and the core desire, right? So that's kind of the whole of Enneagram is about that. And then you have strengths, which is if you're thinking about how you're going to be successful, like the most successful, that's what the strengths test is about. And that reader speed thing that I mentioned earlier, essentially it was trying to do behavioral analysis on, millions of people about how is it exactly that you're able to be successful at what you're successful at. And they specifically interviewed the people who were already designated as the most successful in their industry, and we're going after them and asking like, well, how are you successful? And they would do these long batteries, right, and code everything just like research. And so the strengths are really trying to explain how are you going to be successful at something, whereas Enneagram is more about that core motivation. And where I found Enneagram to be the most helpful for me, especially the way that Claire talks about it, is the things that I'm afraid of are often the things that are holding me back or that are making me take actions that I don't want to take. And so I still think that everyone needs to know both of those tools if they're going to have a really well-rounded experience of being a writer, just because so much of the uncertainty that happens in the industry is going to be directly tied to what causes fear in us. And so like all of our coaches are learning from Claire about Enneagram because we think it's been just extremely helpful. And she's going to do some work with us in the future too. So like, yeah, I think they work really well together. So yeah.
That makes so much sense to me, because if we're operating out of fear, you're not like going to your strengths. You're not going to the thing that really is the higher version of yourself to make things happen. And so you're actually defaulting into this place of like, I have to do this because I have to do this, or if I don't do this, this bad thing's going to happen, where you would take very different actions if you were like, nothing can fail. Of course, this is going to work for me. So oh, it's so interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the way that we used to get at that, because we can always hear it when it's happening, right? Like I can hear when fear starts to creep in, and the way we would always get at it was through a strengths way. And part of the difficulty in doing it with strengths is that what we call basement behaviors, which are like how strengths work against you, the basement behaviors of strengths are often motivated differently depending on what your Enneagram numbers were. I was literally just talking about my coaches about this yesterday, where we said, if you look at the way that a empathy 3 and an empathy 9 are different, like the fears that are driving them are really what is different, where they have a really high empathy person, but what they're afraid of and how you solve that fear and how you help them work out of that fear is going to be different based on why they're afraid of the thing. And if you don't know how to naturally hear that, because I have a strength called individualization that makes it easier for me to hear that without needing to categorize it. But man, the Enneagram has just been like life-changing for us in terms of like helping to have a place to send people, also because Claire's so good at what she does. And she's so good at hearing, the actual motivation that's there.
Right.
And so I refer people to her all the time. She's so brilliant.
Right. I love it. And it's just, to me, even it's been really interesting to discover. I always thought for a very long time, and Claire and I had talked about this, where it was like, I thought I was an Enneagram 1, but I'm not. I mean, like after redoing the test and like going through it after getting her book, I realized I was a 9, and I have a 1 wing, which is great, but it was like, and I have an 8 wing actually, but understanding I was a 9, all of a sudden it was like all those things clicked together, and I'm like, oh, I get this. Yeah. And now those core fears and the core desires make more sense. And it was just like, it was such an aha moment for sure. And it's so great to use all of those in your writing too. I mean,
we sort of joke about the, I can't remember if this was at Idaho or if it was at a different conference, but we were joking about Like there are so many different tests and they are all helpful on some level, like for something, right? Every
Right.
single time you have a designation of different continuums of some kind, there's going to be some level of helpfulness to it. And we were sort of joking about like, if you tell me what kind of bagel you are, I could tell you what that means about you, right? Because
Nice.
there's something that you're latching onto about that identity that is giving you a way to explain yourself to other people so that you're understood. And essentially, we're explaining the different facets of our personality through like either metaphor, analogy, or something like that, right? But it
Yeah.
says something about who we are, the way that we latch onto those identity pieces. So I find that people who, no matter what designation that they're using, there's always something helpful in understanding how people would categorize themselves or what they find to be the most helpful about those different designations. And so I've had people come to me and give me tools that I've never even heard before. And I'm like, oh, I can see why that resonates with you. So let's talk about why that works and then see if there's an application, right? Because I think that's part of where the coaching comes in. It's like, okay, it's great to know all of this stuff, but what difference is it going to make for you and how you're acting? Like that's where I find
Yeah.
strengths and Enneagram to be the most helpful, is they're the most predictive. And
Right.
so if I talk to you as a 9, I am more likely to be able to guess and help with what I'm a 2, with what you're wanting to get out of your experience as an author, if I know certain things that are already aligned about you. So it's really just a shortcut. And um, the strengths in the Enneagram just I find to be the most helpful.
I love that. I love them so much. So speaking of the strengths, so for anyone who hasn't like really learned a whole lot about it or heard a whole lot about it, could you explain what the Clifton strengths are and like how they work out? Because you've already mentioned that there are 34 of them, but
Mhm.
what is it?
So the program was initially developed to try to explain just how different success is for everyone. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but because I wasn't alive when this was written. It was written in like 1925 or something. But there was this really famous book about why people are successful, and what success psychology was in its origins was basically studying individual people and then applying that one example to like everyone. So
Um,
like Napoleon Hill, I think was the name of the author of the book. And it was basically like, well, if you wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you do this, this, and this, then you're going to be super successful. And then all of a sudden you have all these other successful people who are like, well, Einstein didn't do that. And, this person didn't do that. And then all of a sudden it feels like it invalidates everything that
mm,
has been said about all of these other successful people, when that's not the point at all. The point is to say, yeah, some of you are going to be successful doing it this way. Some of you are going to be successful doing it a different way. And it's valid for both of you to be wired the way that you are. So when success psychology was in its infancy, the Dr. Clifton, who was the creator of this, was running these experiments, just trying to figure out why people were so different. Like why would the reader speeds experiment results be as massively different as there must be a huge amount of import placed on the fact that you have natural talents that you can multiply. Every time I do that, by the way, that story about the 3,000 words a minute reader speeds, and I ask I'm almost 100% sure this happened when we were doing it in Idaho, where I would ask the room, like, where do you think the 350 group ended up? And everybody was like, 350. That's where they always start, is like, we think instinctively in well-rounded terms, and we don't realize how insidious that mindset is,
right.
where if I have a weakness, I need to go and fix this weakness so I can get my 90 up to 150, because my God, I can't be average at anything. And I'm like, screw average. Who cares about average? There are things that you are phenomenal at that you're ignoring because you think you can't get any better at them than you already are, as
Mm,
opposed to you have a top 1% capacity to be reached in these areas. Like, I think I first heard about strengths when I was 24 years old. I'm 44. 20 years ago, my number one input was like baby talk compared to where my input is today. because I intentionally worked on it over the course of 20 years, right? And I did so much development on that input. I'm doing things today, Sherlock level, that to like what my 24-year-old self would have thought. I never thought it was possible to get to where I'm at now. And part of that is because we don't think expansively enough about our success capacity. We constantly are thinking about weakness fixing. And from a perspective, just this is why I use the numbers all the time, right? I'm like, do you want to go from 90 to 150 and then still be average at it at the end? Or would you rather take your natural capacity and then maximize it to its fullest potential and go after that top 1% area, especially because this is maybe the biggest danger of strength, is that our weaknesses are not our 30 to 34 numbers, right? Like I'm a number 34 consistency. I am not a weak at consistency person. I don't care about consistency. It does not register for me. I am too much input sometimes because it's my number one, right? So my biggest problem is not that I need to get better at consistency, where I'm not even in the average range on consistency. I am F, like I fail. So like, I don't want to try to get to be a better failure at consistency. I instead want to try to hone my input to a place where it's working for me. And because of the way that the clusters of behaviors work, because each one of those strengths represents, like input, for instance, is a cluster of 12 different behaviors. And so if I want to get better at input, I need to work on those 12 behaviors and stop trying to get better at the 9 behaviors that are in consistency. Those don't matter to me. Like somebody else can be good at that stuff, but I want my input to not work against me anymore. And that's what the development work for me has been over the last 20 years. But too many of us have you can't possibly get any better than 350 mentality. And when we start guessing numbers, like, well, where do you think it went? 350, 450, 500, 550. I'm like, oh my God, at least twice that. You guys move a little faster. Like, and then I just finally am like, no, 3,000. Like it was 3,000, everybody. And
Like
no one
huge.
believes me, right? Because it's such a huge difference. The world record was 25,000 words a minute. So it's not even that big at 75% comprehension. This is what people don't understand. Like when you are phenomenal at something, you are so much better than the average people can even fathom, that it's not worth talking to the average people about it, because you really need to be honing in on these, because again, they could be working against you at the level that they're working for you. And we'd rather have them working for you at 3,000 words a minute than against you at 3,000 words a minute.
Yes. Now, do you find that the most important are the first 5 or the top 5 or the top 10? Because I know like when you get your reports that it gives you both, like you know for sure these are your top 5s, but here's your top 10. Like, does it matter?
Yeah, it totally depends on the person. So there are some people who are so instinctive at their top 2, 3, 4 that it really is a very marked difference between like their top 3, let's say, and you're not going to be anywhere near that level of good at your number 10 strength. But because, and this is just a function of when Gallup was first publicizing this test, the people who were in charge were all significance maximizer people. Dr. Clifton, the originator of this, was a significance maximizer top 5. And what that means is like, only the greatest is important, right? So it's like, let's focus on your top 5 because that's where your top 1% levels are. But to be fair, like you still can be in the top 10 or 15% through your top 10. So it's not like they're falling down there and they're just worthless to know. But it definitely was the goal of the originator to force us to focus on those higher levels, because of course, when everyone would get their results, and this even happened when I first got trained to coach back in like 2005. So when I first got trained to coach, all of my class was like, I want my full 34 so I can go look at what my bottom strengths are. Like everyone wants to know what their bottom strengths are. And I think Clifton was sort of like, no, though. Like, you need to just look at your top 5, because that's where your excellence is going to, and that's the positive psychology part of strengths, right? It's like, stop weakness fixing
I think
and
that's so
start
funny.
maximizing. Yeah, it's hilarious.
As an Enneagram 9, it's considered peacemaker, right? And my 34 is harmony. I'm going,
Yeah.
how does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Harmony is because the peacemaker, and for me, it all depends on what your core motivation of the peacemaker is really about.
Sure.
Is it about connection with people, or is it about the way that people see you? Like the way that people value you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's about connection with people, then the way that you create harmony around yourself is less important than it would be as a harmony strength, right? Like, because
Sure.
the relational, let's say, flow is going to be way more important from maybe an empathy place or a relator place or an individualization place or something. And it's going to be way less important for me to just never have any conflict around me ever.
That makes sense.
Or the lack
Yeah.
of conflict is going to come from a different place, like strategic or empathy or relator.
Sure. Yeah. And I've got strategic and relator as my top 2. So it's like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah. And it's definitely more about the connection. Like I grew up in a very large, like Irish Catholic family. There was so many cousins, like so many cousins. So it was like, yeah, there was always someone to hang out with and chill with. And it definitely more the connection. I didn't, probably that trailblazer energy. I didn't care so much if people got me, as long as we were hanging out and having a good time. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so were you you mentioned you got certified in 2005, but were you always interested in Gallup strengths, and how did you shift it then to applying it to others? Was that always the goal?
Oh no. In fact, when I first got into it, it was because I went to grad school. Like I had done a nonprofit. I was an executive director of a nonprofit at, I don't know, 23, I think.
Wow.
And yeah, I was the stupidest, I mean, and most wonderful, but like the stupidest decision where I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. I can figure out how to do that. I have a high learner strength, and it was a lot of pressure. And so I ended up going to grad school to try to help myself learn how to do that job better. And I ended up in a program about transformational leadership, which was all about how to make organizations thrive and how to make individual people thrive. And it was based in industrial and organizational psychology. So they made us take the CliftonStrengths. When I first got into the program, it was the very first thing we had to do. And then we got coached in the strengths, actually here where I live currently. And so what happened was I got coached. I walked in that room one person, and I walked out of that room a different person.
Wow.
Because I had just been assimilating my parents' expectations for themselves without realizing that I was never going to be able to do that because I was so different. And I just had no sense for, like, it's okay for me to be different though. And so when I found that out, that it was possible to be successful in like thousands of ways that I had never thought I could be successful in, it just changed my whole life. And I got really obsessed with it. Like, I read and talked to everyone. I went to Gallup immediately. Like I was so obsessed with, like, I just wanted to get certified. I wanted to be able to learn more about it, really. And the coaching was somewhat secondary, I would say, at that point. It was more that I wanted to know more, and that was where you had to go to know more.
Yep.
And then when I took the coaching certification, my mentor, who is now has passed away, but his name was Kurt, and he was phenomenal, just the best. He was like, well, the way that you learn about strengths is you coach people. Like, you need to see it in action, how people are
Sure.
different. And that's really how you learn. And so I'm like, okay. And then I just got obsessed with coaching everyone. I mean, I would coach because I was working in an organization that had different arms throughout, like, the state. And we had a whole ton of people. Every single person that I could get to take the test, I was like, look, just take this test and then send me your results. And I used to carry these little packets around that had codes in them, because you used to be able to buy the books from Gallup that had a rip out code in the back. And I would just buy like 100 of them and then rip all the codes out and carry them around in my bag. And I would just hand them out to people. I'd be like, my email's on here. I had a little sticker that I put my email on the front. After you take the test, send me your results, and I want to talk to you about them. And I just got obsessed. And I would coach literally everyone who would even talk to me. I mean, in line at the grocery store, on the plane, like anywhere, people would talk to me
Because
about
it's
it.
all that input coming in,
It was,
right?
oh
It's
my
all the
God, it
input.
was input.
Yeah.
Yep. And when Kurt told me that, he basically told me, like, you just need to input as many people as possible. Right. And so I'm like, okay, 10,000 people later, I'm finally at a point where I'm like, I feel like I kind of understand this now. Like, I feel like I get this. But what happened with writers, which was just still to this day, it feels a little bit like a whirlwind because when I first started, you couldn't be a enterprise coach. Like they wouldn't allow you to go coach outside of your organization. So the only place I was able to coach and get paid for it were when I was inside of an organization that was using strengths. Everything else I had to do for free, just as like, hey, if you want to talk to me about it, I'll talk to you about it, basically, right?
Yeah.
And so I assumed I would never be able to do strengths unless I worked for Gallup. And
Right.
so when I was coaching writers, I actually started teaching productivity because I was teaching a system about like sort of holistic productivity. Like you need to understand all these resources that you have and understand yourself in these 6 different areas and blah, blah, blah. And I had this holistic productivity class, but every single time I would get someone in there, I was like, I want to talk to you individually. And every time I would start coaching someone, it's like, well, I can't really coach you unless I know your strengths because I can coach you on such a deeper level if I know your strengths. And so Gallup by that time had enterprise coaching where you could go get certified officially as like a public coach, where they would certify you to be able to make money as a Gallup certified coach. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do that. And then I just kind of didn't look back after that. It was so incredible. And because we'd already been coaching people in author, like indie productivity and, indie stuff like that, we already had a bunch of people who were very excited about strengths because we had been sharing it with everyone. Right. And so I was just very excited to be able to finally start coaching officially and be able to like actually coach strengths and have the support of that community, because it really is the most accurate, the most effective tool that I have ever seen, just in terms of the nuance that you can get to because of how complex it is. But then that also means that you have to really understand it. So I think it's a little daunting to some people because when you get the 34, it's like, there's 34 words and I don't know what these words mean. And I have to learn what all the words mean. And then somebody has to sit down with me and help me understand how to apply this. And so it definitely is sort of a commitment of time that people have to go through. But again, for me, like that one coaching appointment, and we see this happen constantly with people where you sit down to coach with us one time, and because we know so much about the strengths and they're so predictive, it's like there are so many questions that I could jump ahead in asking you because I don't have to ask you all of the basic questions that you've already answered for the test, right? It's like, well, we already know that these are the things that you want. So let's focus on these areas where you're really strong. And it's just such a shortcut in helping us be able to help align people's behavior. And so it's just, it's been a metamorphosis for sure. It was not anything I ever thought I would be doing. In fact, if you had told me 10 years ago that I was going to be a professional coach of strengths, I would have assumed I would have to be working for Gallup at that time because they didn't have certification for enterprise yet. And so I would have been like, oh, good, I'm going to be working at Gallup. But then I thought, but then I won't be writing. So now I get to do both of them, which is like the best of all worlds for me.
Right. It's so amazing when you can marry those things up. It was kind of the same for me when I've always been very interested in manifestation and like new age experiences and things
Yeah.
like that. And then all of a sudden it was like one day I was like, I could marry these two things up. Like, why am I not doing that? And
Yeah.
then since that point, it's like, this is so much more fun because now I can talk about
Yes.
the two things I love in the same place. It's so
I
cool.
know, it's so true. And the obsession level, right? Like when you
Yeah.
really, really get into something, it's just, oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
it's
I think
amazing.
your coach was so right, because as you teach other people, it's reinforcing everything in your own brain and it's making more sense and it's becoming so clear. I'm signed up to be one of your students for Strengths for Authors, and I'm so excited because
Oh,
I can't wait to see how all that comes together, because I find your approach to coaching so interesting. It's like you described it as being Sherlock Holmes and being able to like slow down time and see all those things. And to me, it's like you're a composer of music and you're able to hear all the different instruments before it's even on paper. It's like you can hear people talking and hear people, when they're speaking with you, and already know, the probabilities of what their strengths are. It's like a superpower. I swear to God. What's
it
that
is.
been like? Like, has that
Yeah,
been like weird?
it's very weird. And interestingly, the place that I see it the most and I have the most difficulty with it is actually in personal relationships and not in professional. Because in professional relationships, almost always when writers are talking to other writers, they are looking for help, right? Like they are
Sure.
like, what do you know? How could you help me? How could I help you? Like we're a very helpful kind of bunch of industry people, which is amazing. And so I never find that people are weirded out when I know things about them in like author conversations. There's usually a relief, right? It's like, oh my gosh, finally
Someone
somebody
gets
who
me.
understands. Yeah, like
Yes.
somebody gets me. What's been hard is like I've been dating recently after moving. Do not recommend, 0 stars. It is not fun. But it's made it very, very difficult to form new friendships and form new, romantic relationships with all of the knowledge that I have, because I find myself being so fast to move into coach mode, right? Like when they're expressing something, like I dated a guy back in Montana. It was a long time ago, but I dated a guy who was struggling with a particular thing that I coach people about all the time. And I found myself just on a date. We're literally at a steakhouse and I'm just on the date, like shifting into coach mode. And I can't even help that I'm doing it because he needs help so much. He's so desperate to get help for this thing. And I'm like, well, have you thought about blah? Oh my God. I've been, and I'm like, oh, cool. And now I don't want to kiss you anymore. Right. It's like, that sucks. I can't. But that has been not as fun. And people who don't know me in the author sphere tend to get very weirded out when I know things about them that I shouldn't know. Right. And so that has been a challenge. And I think I am happy being single for a while because it's just been too much of a challenge for me. But generally in the author community, people are very receptive and they're interested in the help. So I find that it's just a lot easier to kind of be a little bit,
You can just be like, it's
I know
fine. I'm
things about
psychic. That's
people.
how this works.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's just psychic. It's
And
totally
so I'm
cool.
just a psychic. I promise I'm not in your house watching you.
Right.
Like that's the thing, right? Is they're like, because of course of the dating, it's like, well, are you Googling me? And I'm like, no, you're just very predictable. Like very predictable.
Are you someone that then would want someone who is unpredictable, who makes you like have more of a challenge?
No, actually, I find that has not been a good fit for me in the long
Okay.
run. And it's not that I don't like unpredictable people as friends, because I have some of those. It's more just that in my very, very close relationships, I need a lot of security. And so the closer someone is to me, the more helped I am by not having to guess about what they're thinking or doing. And so it's predictability is so much easier for me to handle in really, really close relationships. Yeah. Which is weird probably, but
no, I think that makes a lot of sense, because then you know what to expect from them. Like if you were going to tell them something that is, close to your heart, you can somewhat predict that they are going to be kind and loving and capable of handling the information you're giving them. That makes total sense to me. Yeah. If they're unpredictable, it's like, do I tell them this? Like,
And then I spend a lot of time, of course, being a chronic overthinker, right? I spend a lot of time overthinking about, did I say the wrong thing, or did I reveal too much, or should I not have told them this? And especially, and I'm sure you get this as well, even just meeting new friends, right? Where it's like, I mean, do I talk to them at all about what I do for a living? Because it's kind of complicated and nuanced, and it's sort of easier to just say like, I don't know. What do you do? Like, let's just not talk about
I
it. So
coach
like,
authors. It's fine.
oh
That's
yeah,
it.
there's a
Boom.
lot. But also like it's a real, it's all of the information that I have been given from all of the experiences I've had is such a gift, and I wouldn't trade it. Cause like somebody actually asked me that the other day. They're like, well, if you could go back and tell yourself like how hard it would be to like make brand new friends. Cause of course I just moved. I was like, would you not move in order to like save yourself all of this difficulty? And I'm like, no, I still would have done it. Like we can do hard things. It's okay. I'll be all right. But also the situation that I was in before, it needed to be done. I was done.
Well,
So
if you ever want
no,
to
I
get
still
into
would
a
have done it.
prettier part of Minnesota, because we talked about that before the
Yeah.
show started, this area is very pretty and we can hang out and have coffee all the time.
I know, I had no idea you were here too. I mean, I do intend to go up there at some point though.
Well,
So
if
I'll
you
have to
come up this
contact
way, you
you.
better, yeah, let me know and we'll
Yeah,
have
yeah,
like
yeah.
lunch or something. Oh my gosh,
Hmm.
that would be
Yeah,
amazing. Then we'll have
that'd
to
be
be
great.
like, guys, guess who we're hanging out with today?
I know that would be fun. You'll just put it on social media. Everybody will be jealous. And then
Right.
you will not be allowed to join us. No, I'm just kidding. And that's mostly because like I do so much better with very, very small groups of people, like one-on-one when I'm hanging out. Yeah.
Same. Relator, number one relator over here.
Yeah. Yeah. Individualization for me, but
Uh,
yeah, very similar.
yes. Oh, I love that. Now, one
Yeah.
of the things I want people to understand about this, and I heard you talk about it on your YouTube channel. I can't remember which video it was. I've watched so many, but you're talking about with the success archetypes, that, authors shouldn't obviously change everything all at once. And that when you understand your success archetypes and when you understand your strengths, it's not about then chasing trends, but it's actually helping you get set up for the long game of indie authorship. Do you still find that to be the case?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the majority of what we find when people come to do coaching with us, right, is that their instincts are already trying to align them in this direction.
Mm.
Like they're already, if they're dominant in like a major thinking strength, they're already trying to find time to think, and they feel guilty about doing it because they're like, oh, but it's not productive. And I'm like, nope, if you have these strengths, thinking is working. You need to walk away from the computer and go do these other things so that it will help you, have a better experience writing the book. And so many of them are caught up trying to be productive, like
Mm.
and I put air quotes around that intentionally because the productivity industrial complex doesn't like people who don't produce something with every single minute of their day, right? So if
Right.
you are a person who sits around thinking, or like if you're a creative artist and you need to like have some space to kind of get your head around a project, they're like, well, you're not being productive though. Like, where's the evidence that you actually worked these minutes? And I'm like, the evidence is it takes me 3 hours of thinking for every hour of writing. So if I want to go write for an hour, I need to have 3 hours or 2 hours or whatever it is for each individual person of creative brain space that will allow
Yeah.
me to be able to do that writing. That's what the product is. But we don't like that because it's not easy to monetize. And so anything that's hard to monetize in this world that we live in right now is very hard to convince ourselves that we should be doing. So I think a whole portion of what I'm trying to get across to authors is to sort of question the premise of the productivity industrial complex, period, and to make sure that you're aligning with your instincts about what you actually need to produce the books that you're going to be happy with, that are going to give you a long-term career, because we don't want you to be doing this flash in the pan like so many people have to do because they just wear themselves out doing it 3 years and done, right? Like we want you to be doing this for your whole lifetime. And that means we have to be more intentional about sustainability, which always means being aligned to your
I
personality.
I love that so much because like when I first started teaching, I was creating a course called Rapid Release Roadmap because I kept getting
Mm,
questions like, how do you produce quicker, faster? And I wanted to give them information on like how to structure it, because what is my strategic is number two for me. And so I can look at it and I can go, okay, these are the ways that you can get everything put together and you can build your speed up and be able to do things. But the more I was looking at the various ways of rapid releasing, the more I'm like, these are not sustainable. Like people are going to burn out in like kill themselves with these. Let's focus on the one that's going to make them the most sustainable in doing it. And so that's how rapid release roadmap became like teaching them how to do 4 a year or less sometimes, because it's like whatever, but giving them that permission that it doesn't have to be a book a month. You know, it doesn't have to be like super crazy, because it just felt to me like we're putting people on this, you know, super path towards burnout.
Yep.
You know,
and we've seen it happen, right? Like we've actually seen after the gold rush, we saw people just burning out en masse from 2019 through 2023. And we're really still not through the tail end of like the burnout generation in this industry. And the downside is, because there's always new people cycling in, and those of us who, when we burn out, we watch other people who have a higher capacity for not burning out than we do, then it makes us want to get back into that race again, instead of trying intentionally to do the sustainable choice. And just from statistics, 57% of authors have at least a dominant intellection trait, which means that they're going to need more thinking than the average person. And they're probably not going to write more than 3 or 4 books a year at their absolute best, assuming all things go perfectly and no crises happen and nothing upends anything. And that is maybe slightly more sustainable. But even then, the majority of intellections would actually benefit from allowing their intellection to be the driver of when they release. And so just the fact that we're questioning the premise of the 12 books a year, 24 books a year, 48 books a year style, right? Is like just the fact that we can QTP that, but also there are people out there who can write 12 books a year sustainably. There are people who've been doing it for 10 years sustainably, but it's a small percentage of the population. And it always aligns with particular personality traits that allow them to be on that kind of treadmill and never run out. And it isn't just practice, right? I think that's the thing, is like a lot of people who are able to do that don't see their 3,000 words a minute level capacity to do that thing, or they do, and they don't realize how hard it will be for other people to get to that place. But it is so different for each and every person what sustainability looks like. And that's part of why I do a lot of like caveating, right? Because it's like, well, yeah, some of us will only write 1 to 3 books a year, and some of us are going to sustainably write 48 and be fine. But again, what works for one person has no relevance to other people. It's not a promise that I can do that. It's just, it is possible.
Absolutely.
But not for everyone.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And it just makes sense to me that each person, especially with when you described it as the intellectual, like if there's an intellectual strength in your chart or in your results, it makes sense that like as authors, we would have that, and that we would need the space to cultivate it in a way that the creativity can come in and then expand. Because otherwise, if you're going, it kind of feels like you're on that treadmill of just like spewing it out as quickly as possible. And you're not really, I don't know if honing it is the right word, but like you're not really bringing it into its fullest embodiment, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
Creatives definitely need that space to be creative, like to hear the wisdom of it all, I think. Yeah. So do you have any resources then for authors? I mean, I know that you teach and coach authors for their strengths, but do you have...
Oh, there we go. Now we're back. For some reason, I think it might be my internet was back, but yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So for authors who are really interested in diving into their strengths, do you have some resources that they can start digging into, whether it be, you know, through your YouTube or like obviously your coaching? What kind of things can they get involved with you and your team to be able to figure out their own personal strengths?
Yeah, usually our goal is to get people to take the test first. And there are a couple of ways that you can take the test. One is there is a book called StrengthsFinder 2.0 on Amazon that you can purchase. Make sure you buy a brand new version. Yes, that one, because it has a code in it that you can cut out. And those red packets I was telling you about, that's from those books. Got it. So take the test first. And you're going to get a report from the test that'll kind of tell you like, here's your top 5. And then from there are individual definitions inside of Gallup's book about what all of the strengths are. And then once you start watching our YouTube channel, and you can pick out sort of I would pick out topics that are the most relevant for you. Like I would kind of go, here are my strengths. Then I'm going to go look at our topical videos and say, like, I really struggle with productivity. So I'm going to go watch the productivity. I'm in burnout. So I'm going to go watch the burnout. And that's kind of how we encourage people to start off, because the book is sort of the scientific, like, this is what the core definition is about. And then sort of similar to how Kurt described it to me, right? How you live into those strengths is either through coaching, being coached yourself, or through listening to other people talk and sort of attributing different things to strengths. And then just taking in the information with the lens of, I'm listening for those traits now. I'm listening for someone who, if I have a number one input, I'm listening for those people who are also curious, who also like to collect resources, who also are very, helpful. And then if I'm a number one strategic, I'm listening for those people, which, by the way, a huge portion of the nonfiction industry in the writer sphere is either a number one or number two strategic. Like, then I don't know every single person's strengths, but the ones that I do know, it has been almost predictable that they're either a number one or a number two strategic, which is not surprising, just because strategics are usually ahead, they're usually ahead of the curve. But I want to listen for that language in other people, and then also kind of let the strength sink in and what the meaning is. So if I have a high empathy strength, which means that I'm very receptive to other people's emotions, then I want to think not just about the fact that I have that, but that not everyone else does. Right. So I may be having expectations of other people and how they respond to my emotions that are unrealistic, because I don't have super high empathy and I'm married to an empathy person, for instance, like that. Or, similarly to basically every other strength. But yeah, I would say I would start first with the test, and then I would go and watch our topical videos. And then from there, if you want to go deeper, there's always deeper stuff to go in, but not everybody does. Some people will go watch a video like this, go take the test, read the report, feel really good about it, and then never darken our doorway again. And I'm totally fine with that.
Right.
If you want more coaching, we definitely offer it. I still think coaching is the best way. It's why we organize these cohorts. In the Strengths for Writers is really just a cohort of coaching, where we say, okay, everybody's going to come in at one time and you're all going to go through the process of scheduling your coaching and getting in with a coach. And then we do follow-up calls. But the Strengths for Writers is really just coaching calls, right? So it's not really a class, but we do it that way because the strengths are the best applied on an individual basis and not on a corporate learning sort of basis.
I love that. And I love how it's structured too, just from my perspective of, I don't know if it's the strategic part of me or the
strategic activator. Yeah. Wanting to be done quicker, right? Wanting to get in.
I love that smaller aspect of it, being able to learn kind of what's to be expected through the course part of it. Cause there is a course part, it's written. But then going, oh my gosh, I get to actually give my information over the 34 results and find out how these are being best applied to my personal career and how I should
by
be
sitting down
it.
with an expert.
Yeah, by sitting down with an expert that actually knows what the heck they're doing, instead of me just going, okay, I think I'm reading this right.
Yeah.
If I understand this correctly.
Yeah, it is very, very nuanced. Yeah,
for sure.
Well,
yeah.
cool.
And it's so cool. Well, Becca, thank you so much for being here today and sharing so much. We're going to have you back. Like I mentioned before we started, because what you do is just so broad and full of depth that there's so many ways that we could do it. I was even struggling to figure out what are the best questions to ask here, because there is so much we could cover. But obviously you're welcome to come back whenever you'd like. But before we go, would you like to give the details of where my audience can find out more about you, your books, and all of your coaching aspects, your courses and everything?
Yeah, we have a book in Kindle Unlimited right now, which is actually unusual. I usually don't put any of my books in KU, and it's going to come out by, I think, the end of July. But the author stuck list, which is the most recent release that we did, is in KU. So if you have a KU subscription, you can go pick that up for no cost. and go read that. That's all about If You Get Stuck, helpful for that. And it'll have links to all of the other books if you want them. The best place though is to go to either our podcast or YouTube channel, because I find that a lot of what happens when people are first introduced to me is like, okay, we're really excited about, let's say, the strengths test. And then if what works best for you is to go take the test and never talk to us, then that's what you should do. And if you want more, we do podcasts about all kinds of topics related to writing, trying to help the different personalities of writers sort of acclimate to things. We also talk a lot about burnout and sustainability. We've been talking a ton about getting stuck, right? Because I wrote a book about the stuck place. And then but just we try to cover as many topics as we can about writers. So I always encourage people to go there first. I know that's because I'm an input. So I'm like, go sample the information, see what helps you, and then decide if you want more from there. Because for some of you, you'll just listen to a couple of videos and be fine. And for others of you, you're going to listen to every video and then still want to do Write Better, Faster or Strengths for Writers. And that's also fine. But you can get plenty out of the resources just by like subscribing on iTunes, like
Right.
it's
Well, I suppose
there's a lot.
If they input at least some of the information that's already freely available, now you're on the same like language. You guys can talk specifically and speak the language together instead of you having to like start from ground level going, okay, well, here's what this is. Like,
it's so much easier.
Total sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Cool.
Well, Becca, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that you're here, and we are definitely going to have to do this again.
Yeah, that'll be great. And thank you for having me. I had a great time.